This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
Real conversations and some hard truths. Gangs, drugs, and guns. Giving a voice to those willing to sacrifice. We have stories that need to be told. We have lessons that need to be taught. Protect and serve. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Welcome back, everybody. Nathan Romas with you. This week, we are continuing the story of Callie Love. So you will have to have listened to last week's episode, part 1, to know where we are at now. So this will be a direct continuation from the conversation there as we continued recording and broke it into 2 parts. So this will be the second half of that. So last we discussed your story to a point where you'd managed to escape your captors, so to say, and this Sam character has aided you in your escape, but there's a familial connection there as you'd discovered. So you are now with Sam. What happens next?
So I end up running away from him. I go to one of my friends' houses, and during this time, my friend, lived in a trap house. So I go there, and one of the people there, I guess, was on Backpage. And you could see the top of my bra and stuff like that through my shirt. And it was the same bra I was wearing in the photos of Backpage. And it was a pretty like distinct color and pattern. Um, and somebody had showed the pictures of me and asked if that was me. And I remember saying no. And so basically it became this whole thing where my entire friend group thought that I was escorting. And so I left my friend group. Um, and then I ended up, sleeping again on park benches. And I was too embarrassed to go around anybody that I had known at this point. Um, so I started chilling at the Ajax Public Library, and I met a group of kids there or teenagers there. And I started hanging out with them. And I would couch surf between trap houses. There would be some nights I'd be sleeping on the sidewalk. Um, and then I ended up, starting to ask people on the street for money for food. And then I ended up starting to steal from grocery stores and stuff like that as well for things like food, but also, for ridiculous things like makeup or just random like candy or things that I never would have been able to have beforehand, just to kind of make myself feel human. Um, and then I ended up in a shelter in Scarborough. I had lied about my age. And basically, to be in a shelter, you need to have ID. And since this was a youth shelter, it's ages 16 to 24. And I obviously was 15 at this time. So I was underage. And I had 3 days to get ID. So I basically kept on like leaving the shelter and then coming back in a couple days. So I stayed there on and off. And then I ended up getting arrested for stealing from another store. I got a bunch of charges and I ended up on house arrest. But they put me on house arrest without an ankle bracelet. So I was back at a group home. It was out in Whitby. And I ended up running away again from there. But running away from the shelter in Whitby, it was in the middle of nowhere. So I would have to walk from um literally it was in like the farm area. I had to walk all the way to downtown Oshawa, which took like 4 or 5 hours
Wow.
without a map, without any sort of like phone directing me. I literally just followed the road. I ended up back in the shelter again. The shelter's now closed down, but it was called Second Base at the time. And I started dating a guy there. He was a little bit older than me. and he had schizophrenia. At this time, I didn't know he had schizophrenia, and I was actively addicted to meth again at this time. And then he decided that he wanted to go hitchhike to BC, and I didn't want to, leave him at this point, even though he was abusive. And I ended up hitchhiking to BC with him. So we left from Scarborough and we started walking, and there was a lot of getting in random trucks,
Hmm.
and literally it's like in the movies, you're holding your thumb out on the side of the highway. I remember being on the Trans Canada Highway and having to hide every single time we saw a police officer car because it's illegal to actually hitchhike.
Mm.
So I think we made it there within about 2 months. And it took a lot longer. And that was just because during the way, obviously, he was abusive and I was addicted to meth. So there was a lot of dilly-daddling and fights and running away from each other and meeting back up.
And at this time, did you have any supports in your life? Like, is anybody involved, or is it literally just you and him?
It was just me and him. I had completely isolated myself from everybody from my past because I was embarrassed. I felt like everybody had viewed me as, and obviously this isn't accurate, but as like, a dirty escort.
Mm.
So I had this like fear of everybody else's opinion of me. So I really did isolate myself. And even the friends who brought me to the shelter, I ended up isolating from as well. And during this time when I was hitchhiking, I had no phone, neither did my partner. And even though it was like obviously a very abusive and hard time in my life, and there was a lot of sleeping on sidewalks or behind dumpsters, it was also very beautiful because I got to see parts of the country that I never would have seen. Like walking, for instance, my favorite memory of that time was walking through overgrown rail tracks. So when you go down, like, on Via Rail or whatever, and you pass through, there's all this like fences that are covered by vines and like flowers and stuff. And this was
Mhm.
during the summertime. So it was so beautiful. And arriving in Vancouver, or well, my first time seeing a mountain was in Alberta, and just the amount of I'm very connected to nature. So it was just so surprising how big mountains actually are and how beautiful it actually was. So many people will ask me, even to this day, like, "Oh, would you ever do that again?" And even though I say no because of safety reasons, I still think it was like one of the most beautiful times in my life, and I really got to experience Canada for what it is and get out of the city.
Yeah.
So it was really beautiful. And then we made it to BC, and he ended up beating the living crap out of me to the point where I was in the hospital. I had told him I was sexually assaulted, but he didn't believe me. And I got sexually assaulted because he asked me to go find somebody to buy meth off of. And then he didn't want to come because he thought I would get it for cheaper because I was a girl. And then the guy ended up raping me. And then I went back to him with no drugs, and he didn't believe me. So he beat the crap out of me.
This is in Vancouver, this part?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I ended up in the hospital. And at this point, I was still lying about my name and age. My partner knew my real name and age. It was just more to like, the authorities or the hospital or the shelters I was staying in. And when I ended up in the hospital, I was in there for about 2 days. And on the second day, I really felt like I had nowhere else to turn. And I was scared if I went back to my partner that he would kill me.
Mm.
So I ended up calling Sam and I asked him to buy me a ticket back to Toronto, which he did.
How come you keep going back to Sam though? Like, what is it that makes you? Because even before you're saying like you didn't quite trust him, and you've had several run-ins with police, but obviously for good reason. You don't necessarily trust the police because of the what we talked about in the last episode. But why Sam? Like, why? What was the connection that kind of made you go back to this person of all people?
To be honest, it was one of those things where I felt like nobody else would answer my call.
Oh, okay.
I really did feel like nobody loved me, nobody cared. And sorry, even if I didn't trust him, it was one of those things of like a last resort. I'm left alone. I have no idea how to get anywhere. And even if, let's say, I did call one of my old friends, none of them is going to have the money to be able to get me a ticket and then not expect me to pay it back.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of became one of those things when I was at my wit's end and it was more of life or death situations. I would call him and he would kind of help me get out of it. So definitely not the healthiest relationship, but it was definitely one of those last resorts. And at least I knew if I called,
Hmm.
my call would always be picked up. So I ended up coming back to Toronto and I bounced back and forth between Covenant House and a couple other shelters, including, some nights when the shelters were full, I'd end up sleeping on sidewalks down on like Dundas Square, Yonge Street area in Toronto. And again, I was still underage at this point. So I was 15, and the shelters started to kind of pick up on the fact that I was purposely not getting my ID. So Covenant House was actually the only shelter that fought for me to stay there without ID, and they kind of gave me that, like, feeling of home. So I kept on circulating around there for about the next year. I ended up finally getting sober near the end of me being 15 going into 16, and that was really just out of because of who I was hanging out with. I sort of switched from hanging out with people who did meth and crack, and then I started hanging out with people who really looked down on it, even though they were still doing other drugs.
And they're still in the shelter?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the peer pressure kind of helped me get off of that because I didn't want to be viewed as a meth head or a crackhead. And then at 16, I got pregnant with my son. His name was Hayden, and the father at the time only wanted to be around our son if I was willing to be in a full-fledged relationship with him. And during this time, I had also found out he was actually married and he was older than he had told me.
Oh, wow.
And he was going through like a separation situation, but he was still seeing the wife.
So this guy he wasn't from the shelters, I'm gathering?
So he was. I met him at the shelter because his wife kicked him out for a night and he ended up going to the shelter.
Hmm.
And then he went back home to his wife. And then we kept on seeing each other on and off for a couple months. And at this time, I had no idea he had a wife. I had no idea he was, from what I remember around that time, he was like 26. When I met him, he told me he was 22. So even though it's not that big of a jump, it still is.
Yeah.
And he knew my real age and everything. And when I ended up pregnant with my son, he basically told me that him and his wife are figuring things out and they're looking into basically an open relationship. And the only way he'd be willing to be around, our son was if I was okay with everything. And I stayed in a relationship with him, which I did not want to do. So I decided, you know what? It's better than being in a stressful situation. So I ended up leaving him. And then when my son was born, I asked him to come to the hospital. He ended up showing up, but then I never saw him again after that. Within, I would say, the first about 2 months, 3 months of my son being born, I was in the hospital with him multiple times a month. And I had children aid services, circling around my life at this point because I was considered Crown Ward and I was young. So they instantly took on my case. And during this time, I really felt like there was something wrong with my son. And I had no idea what it was. He wouldn't eat properly. So he was cluster feeding. And then he would cry all night. He wouldn't be able to sleep. So I kept on bringing him to the doctors. They told me he might have colic. They told me to give him this type of like gripe water.
Was he considered a high-risk birth?
No.
But they know your history of drug
Yeah.
use and stuff, and it was just like in, give birth, and out of the hospital?
So, see, Children Aid Services visited me in the hospital, and as soon as he was born, I was like under their watch. I wasn't allowed to move into my own apartment. I was told that I had to live in a shelter so that they could keep a closer eye on me to make sure that I was parenting properly and I wasn't on
Mm,
drugs. As soon as he was born, they did the drug test on him, came back negative and everything. And I was very, at this point in my life, I was mentally unstable. I also didn't want to be living in a shelter with my child,
yeah.
even though it was a shelter specifically for pregnant women and women who just had children. I really wanted to live on my own. So, Children Aid Services and I didn't have the strongest relationship. And then during me bringing him to the hospital so much, they ended up actually telling me I was putting him at risk of getting sick by bringing him to the doctor so much. And they started to basically tell me that they think there's something wrong with me mentally and I'm trying to make up that he's sick. And they actually threatened to apprehend him if I kept on bringing him to the doctors, if I kept on not feeding him properly. Because, like I said, I was in the shelter, so they had staff watching me at all times.
Hmm.
And he wouldn't eat for longer than like 2 or 3 minutes at a time. He would stop and then he would go back. So it was the cluster feeding situation. And because they said I was putting him at risk of getting sick from the hospital, I knew that I was pushing my luck with Children Aid Services, and my son's doctor at the time also didn't think there was anything wrong with him. So at this point, I believe he was about like 2 or 3 months old. I called my doctor and I was like, listen, can you just do one more check on him? And I promise you, I will change doctors. You will never hear from me again. And I told her I wanted to bring him to the hospital, but I was scared I'd get more trouble by CAS. So she said, "Fine, bring him in. We'll do one more check." And at this point, I had noticed his belly was growing abnormally, and I brought him into the doctors. And I will never forget, as soon as she laid him down on the table and she started feeling his stomach, she looked at me with the most like sadness in her eyes, I guess you could say it.
Hmm.
And she looked at me and told me that I needed to rush to sick kids. And I looked at her and I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "I feel tumors, or what I believe to be tumors. We need him to go to sick kids and get an x ray or an MRI, whatever it was." And I had asked her if I could go back to the shelter to pick up some clothes for him and some toys. And she told me I didn't have time to do that.
Hmm.
So I rushed to sick kids. They ran a bunch of tests on him. And then within the next 24 hours, I found out he had a rare type of cancer called neuroblastoma. At this time, he was diagnosed with stage 4S. 4 means special, which means that it can go away without chemotherapy.
Oh, really? Okay.
So it was hard, but it was also one of those things of like, okay, well, it could be worse. Let's pray it will get better. Then they told me that they wanted to run a test on him, which I don't remember the exact terms, but it's basically where they put like radiation into the veins to light up all the cancer cells through the MRI. And they told me that there was like less than a 10% chance that it would activate any cancer cells and make it worse. So I remember fighting with the hospital staff, and telling them that if there was even a 1% chance, I didn't want my son to have it done just because what are the chances that he would get cancer? What are the chances that nobody would believe me for so long? Like there was just so many things that was happening. And Children Aid Services took over and they basically, said if I didn't allow him to get this done, I was refusing medical treatment and that he would be apprehended for me right then and there.
Wow. And if I was you, at least I'd be thinking, you denied him all this medical treatment this whole time.
Yeah.
And now you're telling me I'm denying it.
So I
God.
ended up, which was obviously not the right reaction, but I ended up screaming at the doctors. I ended up screaming at Children's Aid Services. And I was like, if it wasn't for me, my son would have gone with these tumors in him for how long? How much longer would he have gone? It just didn't make sense to me. But again, I didn't want to lose my child, so I allowed them to do it.
Mm.
And within 2 weeks, he had new tumors showing up. And very quickly, it went from stage 4S to stage 4. So that meant that he now had to get a plate in his chest. He had to go through the chemotherapy. Um, and during this time, I lived in the hospital with him for well over a month. And obviously, I was 17 at this time. I was very young. It was a lot. It really was. And then he was finally ready to go home. And Children's Aid Services told me that he would not be going home with me because they don't know how the cancer is going to go. And I, in their eyes, was too young to be able to take care of a child with cancer. And they didn't trust me to bring him to all of his appointments because I didn't show up to my appointments,
Mm.
even though I made sure that I brought him to the doctors again and again. And I missed so many of my personal appointments because I was at the doctors with him, pleading with the doctors to check him for everything because I knew there was something wrong. And then they apprehended him for me. So I had thought that they had a warrant to basically be able to apprehend him. I didn't know at the time the papers I was signing because I was crying too much and I was young and naive and I didn't read through the papers. I signed over my rights to him.
Oh, okay. So this wasn't just like I guess in the terms and law enforcement side of things, like a simple apprehension where you're taking them to get some kind of medical care, but
Yeah,
it is fully signing over the rights. So you're no longer the parent or the legal guardian.
yeah.
The agency is.
And my worker at the time told me if I didn't sign that, then there were basically security guards downstairs waiting to escort me out. And they would rather this go down without a fight and for me just to be willing. So I signed what I thought was, in the what they had the rights to do. And then yeah, so I felt, kind of targeted and manipulated by the situation because the entire time all I ever tried to do was figure out what was wrong with my son. After I lost him, I ended up being kicked out of the shelter I was living in the same day because I no longer had a child, so I could no longer stay there. So they boxed up all my stuff for me and told me I had 30 days to get all my stuff out, but I could not live there anymore. So I ended up homeless and I ended up couch surfing. Thank goodness one of my friends ended up taking me in and I went for visits with my son and I started to get in trouble for recording my entire visit with him. And then my visit started to get pulled back
Why would they get upset about that?
and because they said I wasn't focusing my time on my son and I was on my phone the whole time. But in reality, I was taking so many photos of him because he was still going through chemotherapy. And I would have there'd be times where I'd be playing with him and I just prop my phone up so I could videotape our moments together because I didn't know if he was going to survive or not.
Yeah.
And in their eyes, that was me caring more about my phone than the moments with him,
Wow.
which was so far from the reality. So at one point, I was actually not even allowed my phone inside the visitation area. So, the last few times I saw him, I didn't even get to have pictures to be able to look back on now. And very quickly, my visitation started to go down from once a week because he was going in and out of the hospital or he was sick. So, last minute, they would change my visitation. And very quickly, as soon as I stopped being able to see my son and not knowing what was going on with him, I ended up relapsing
Hmm.
on drugs and I was drinking very heavily. And then I finally turned 18 and I think to myself, you know what? I want to start modeling. I want to, start making money. I couldn't really hold down an actual job at this point because I was just too mentally ill to be able to. I still had no idea what was going on with my son. And I was in court trying to, just prove that I could be a mother. But it was hard after, I got kicked out. And then I was living in my friend's basement with no job and nothing. So I ended up modeling. And within a couple months of me modeling, I ended up going out to Montreal for a photo shoot. And I had a court date the next day, like the day after my photo shoot. So my plan was originally just to go to Montreal, leave that night, and then come back to Toronto for my court case.
Can I ask what type of modeling are you doing and how'd you get into that? Like what made you go that direction?
So I started with boudoir modeling, which is like lingerie. I personally don't know why I even went in that direction. I feel like it was more one of those things of like, I've kind of just been taught my whole life that my sexuality is kind of all that I had to offer.
Oh, I see.
So I sort of fell into this like, how else am I going to make money? I don't want to escort. I don't want to sell drugs. And, I don't have any skills to be able to have a job. I remember trying to hand out my resume, but of course, I didn't even know how to build a resume. So I never got a call back.
So how did you find, like, did you just look up an ad or is this like a job work site? Like, where did you find this job that you're about to go to?
So I started posting photos, like taking photos of myself online. And then I had a photographer reach out to me and be like, I would love to take photos with you. You're beautiful. All the red flags that he could
Mhm.
possibly say.
Yeah.
I went to the first photo shoot and I went with my friend, and he was professional. Nothing bad ended up happening. But as soon as I posted like my set of those photos on Instagram, I started to gain a lot of followers very fast. The photo shoot was done outside in the snow, and I was in lingerie. And through that, I had so many photographers reaching out to me asking if I'd be down to do a TFP, which is a time for photos. And I had gotten multiple people in Montreal, because Montreal is huge in the photography scene and modeling scene, asking me if I wanted to go down there to do photo shoots. And I was offered to be paid, which was a huge thing for me because my first photo shoot was not paid. And then I ended up going down to Montreal by myself. The guy had found me on Instagram, and during the photo shoot, I had done something that I'd always promised myself I would never do. I had not only accepted a drink from him that I didn't see him pour,
Oh, okay.
but he also had a lollipop that he pulled out of a Ziploc bag, and he told me to pretend to lick it for the photos. And then at one point, he's like, "It's okay. It's a clean lollipop. Just, like play with it, suck on it, whatever for the photos." I start doing that. And very quickly, I start to feel like I'm drunk. Before I went to the photo shoot, I had one beer, which was a lot less than I normally drank at this time. And hours had passed since that beer. So I knew I was not drunk. I knew that something was going on. And then, very quickly things turned. And I later on the next day realized I was drugged. He ended up sexually assaulting me and videotaped it. And unfortunately, he also ended up sharing those videos to another photographer. And the way I found this out was about a year after this whole situation happened. I had a model reach out to me to let me know that she had been shown my video, and basically, this one photographer and this other photographer had a history of recording women and drugging them and raping them. And she was in the process of pressing charges against him.
Okay.
And she wanted to know if I wanted to press charges too. But I just, I was so taken aback that my video was even shared or that was even a having a random person reach out to you on Instagram being like, "Hey girl, I saw this," and so I did not end up pressing charges against him.
Did this stuff end up online at all? Is it one of those situations where it's kinda getting posted everywhere?
I don't know. I never really asked her more information because I was more scared of the truth than anything. It was one of those things where I felt like if I ignored it for long enough, it would just go away and I would never have to hear about it again.
Mm,
During that time, there was a whole movement of a bunch of models that were assaulted by these two photographers, and they were speaking out online and it was very loud, so it didn't go away like I had hoped it would, at least for myself, but I have no idea what happened, and yeah,
okay.
so the day I was assaulted, um, the next day I had my court date for my son, and I ended up thinking I could manage, so I get on, the Greyhound bus or the Mega bus, whatever it's called, and I come back from Montreal to Toronto. And during this time, while I'm on the bus, I realize, I have blood seeping through my pants because at this point I was on my period and he actually sexually assaulted me while my tampon was still in me.
Mm,
So I ended up having a huge panic attack, I guess is the best way I could put it. And I went to the hospital because it hurt so much. And they helped me, remove the tampon. They did a rape kit. And during the rape kit, I ended up having basically a mental break where I started screaming and like crying and like trying to push away the nurses. And this was one of the first times where I really feel like I went into a psychotic episode, to say the least, because I no longer knew it was the nurses. I thought it was the photographer trying to assault me again.
wow.
So I ended up in the hospital for well over 24 hours. I missed my court date. And because I missed my court date, they revoked my rights to him. It was a pretty important court date.
Yeah.
And I didn't know at this point that I had 30 days to appeal. I found out about a year after my court date had ended. I got all my files and everything that Children Aid Services and the court sent me. And in that, it told me I had 30 days to appeal. And I tried to appeal, and they said no, 30 days from the last court date. So, yeah, I ended up losing all visitation rights to my son. I had no idea what was going on with him. And to kind of sum that up, the last I heard was from an old foster parent who basically messaged me one day. And she had stayed in contact with him, like his new foster parents. And she was a temporary foster parent at the time when she had him. And she had basically messaged me one day and told me that there would no longer be any more updates on him and that basically I should just move on with my life. And he's in a better place now. So I have no idea what that means. To be honest, I tried to message her back and ask her, and she had blocked me. So I have no idea if he's alive or he's passed away
To this day,
to this day.
nobody will give you an update?
Nope, I'm not allowed any information until he turns 18. And even then, I can basically just go and say that I'm okay with him reaching out to me and can have all my information. So, yeah, I have no idea, but I do know that while she was updating me, she told me he did relapse. So he had a relapse of neuroblastoma cancer, and kids who relapse have like a 10% chance or less of surviving. So yeah, I guess I have like 10 more years till I'm able to find out, but I always hope that he survived and he's living his best life. But for me to be able to heal, I've sort of grieved him as well.
Mhm. And at most, you only ever got to see him for 2 months, roughly? 3 months?
So it was around 3 or 4 months that because I lived in the hospital with him for a while. maybe, yeah, he was about 4.5, 5 months. And then the last time I saw him, he was about a year old, and I saw him for all of 5 minutes. And then after that, I have no idea. I never saw him again, never even got like a photo update of him or anything. So yeah. And then I ended up relapsing. Well, like I said, I was relapsed pretty hard. And then I decided that, Ontario and Toronto and Ajax and all these places were just too much for me to live in at the time. I had way too much trauma, and every time I walked the streets of Toronto, I always thought of my son. And when I went out to Montreal, I really did fall in love with Old Port, which, if the listeners don't know, it's very much like old architecture. It's very beautiful. It's almost like Europe style. So I ended up moving out to Montreal to try and get my life back on track. And I ended up moving into an apartment with a house with somebody I met. And there was three other roommates at the time. So while I moved there, I ended up completely isolating myself again, even from my roommates, for about a month or two. And then I had stayed inside my room unless I went out to go eat or like go to the bathroom. And I just went through the withdrawals of meth and crack and everything I was on by myself. And I remember there'd be days where I was literally like cold sweat, shaking, puking, vomiting. And I forced myself to get sober off the drugs, and I ended up during this time, unfortunately, drinking a lot more.
So you stopped all the hard use stuff,
Yeah.
substituted with alcohol. Did any of your roommates know your history or what was happening with you, or they just think, "Nah, she just doesn't talk to us much." Like what's the situation there?
So in the beginning, nobody knew. I ended up dating one of my roommates after about the 2-month period of me sobering up and everything. And then very quickly, people started to hear because my boyfriend at the time liked to tell everybody everything I told him. So very quickly, everybody in the house knew what my situation was. And then I basically woke up one day in bed and I had 4 empty wine bottles around me and one in my hand that was half empty. So that'd be 5 wine bottles in my bed with me.
Wow.
And I had woken up from a dream that I was like 40 years old and I was a homeless crackhead panhandling on the streets of Toronto. And in that moment, something in my brain absolutely snapped. I got up and I still smoked weed at this time and I broke all my bongs. I threw out all the weed I had. I dumped all the alcohol I had. And I decided I was going to be 110% sober moving forward, to the point that I even told my boyfriend at the time, like, if he wanted to stay with me, he couldn't smoke weed or he couldn't drink around me. Like, I really needed to sober up and clean up my act because I really did not want to be 40 years old and homeless.
I wonder too, because I've had another person on here who talked about their experience going through homelessness and just kind of being on the street. But for them, it's like, yeah, they have like this. They had a single event where they kind of step out of this place and they put their foot on the ground and they're like, I had no shoes on, and I just realized like I have to do something. So it was that agency piece. So they took it upon themselves to make the change because, and from everything you're kind of talking about, it sounds very much like, people can offer you a whole bunch of things, but unless the person, the individual themselves decides this is for me and I want to do this, there's almost nothing anybody can do. Like we can force people into treatment, but unless we're forcing them to take pills or whatever it is, like there's only so much outsiders can do. It's all up to the person in the end if they want to turn their life around. Yours kind of seems a little bit different, but similar in the sense like you're the one who's finally making the decision to make that change. Does that sound, is that like a fair assessment? It's up to the individual?
100%.
Yeah.
So I've had people ask me in my life, like, let's say somebody gave you a bunch of money or a promise house that you could have that would always be safe. Would that have changed your life? And I honestly think without that sense of urgency that I gave myself, I wouldn't have changed. Because
Yeah.
right before I moved out to Montreal, I had left my friend's house and I had got my very first apartment on my own. And I was still doing meth. Like I had my own place and I was slowly making money off of modeling and I was still choosing to do drugs. Like I was still choosing to hang out with people who I met when I was homeless who were actively homeless. And I really don't think, because I could have gone back into care, I could have stayed in group homes, but without the fight, there's nothing that would have changed my opinions or my life at all, honestly. Especially the only things that really felt like changed me was getting pregnant with my son or when I got pregnant with my daughter. Because it's one of those things where it's really internal. And even if, you get forced into rehab, that doesn't mean that, you being sober for a couple months, you're not going to end up relapsing again if you're not ready to actually leave that situation 100%.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I ended up getting pregnant by my roommate once I started dating him. And that was a severely abusive relationship. I ended up, you know, having children aid services back in my life. And at this time, they basically told me that because I had my partner and everything, that I could keep my daughter. And I remember asking my worker at one point, like, what would happen if I left my partner? And she's like, well, he will most likely get custody because your history and everything like that. And he has a clean history. And we were both going through therapy at this time and everything. And I never disclosed that he was super abusive to me just kind of because of that conversation and that fear of, I've heard so many stories of women being abused by their husbands and then going to court, and then the child is still allowed access to the father, even though he was abusive to the mother. So I ended up staying with him for a year of her being born. And then after that year, I basically started working in restaurants, slowly saving up. And then I paid him to leave and I paid for his place and I was paying his rent.
Oh, wow. He didn't work at all?
So he got a job and then he got fired from that job and it was
Oh,
at a sports book. And then I ended up leaving the restaurant industry just because I was a sous chef at the time and I found I wasn't able to be as home as much as I wanted to and my stress levels were just beyond anything. Working in the kitchen was so stressful,
yeah.
especially because I only speak English and everybody else spoke French except for the head chef. So it was just a lot. So then he got fired from his job for showing up drunk. And then I ended up calling into his job and said that I knew that they had a spot available because somebody just got fired. And I asked if, they'd be open to hiring me. Very quickly, they found out who I was, but they were okay with it. So I ended up taking his job, which paid extremely well. Like I said, it was a sports book. So I got paid a base rate as well as commission.
Mm,
And if you know anything about sports, I started working basically as football season hit off. And football season is the biggest anything that happens in the world.
yeah.
It is absolutely insane the amount of money that people are pulling in for that. So I was paying for his rent as well as my rent. And in that, we basically had an understanding that anytime children aid services came to visit, he would be at the house and he would lie and act like we were together. And then during this time, I allowed him to have visitations with my daughter. And very quickly, I realized that, he was too mentally unstable. So I ended up finding out that he was abusing his girlfriend at the time in front of my daughter. So I took her and never looked back. Basically, from the lack of better terms, paid him off so he would never come back around us.
Hmm.
And he doesn't care. So he's living his best life now and has, no contact with my daughter. And he has, since it's been so long, it's now legal that he's legally abandoned her because it's been so long since he's ever reached out to ask about her
Wow.
or anything like that. And then, so yeah, I stayed sober. And during that time, I ended up meeting somebody at my job, who I fell in love with very quickly. And he basically told me he wouldn't date me unless I stopped working there. So I handed in my resignation letter and I left my well paying job, which obviously wasn't the smartest thing to do. But I ended up going back into bartending and I also worked at a business to business sales company as well. And during this time, I was also in court suing my landlord for the building I had lived in because she tried to illegally evict me. And she also refused to fix the black mold that was in my bathroom. And the black mold had spread so bad that basically my entire ceiling was black. And it was affecting
Damn.
like my health and my daughter's health. But I didn't have the exact means at the time to be able to just pack up and move out. Like I said, I was paying for 2 rents at this time. So I ended up, yeah, I finally saved up enough. I moved out, found a good place, and I won the court case with my landlord, which took, it was about 2 years I was in court. I ended up firing my lawyers and just doing it myself because I felt like my lawyers were not caring about my case in the way I would. And I won $20,000.
Oh, wow.
So,
Like a small
yeah,
lottery.
literally. And then I ended up moving back to Toronto. I was basically just sitting at home one night with my daughter, and I felt so isolated because I only had one friend in Montreal next to my partner. And I really just felt like, I need to go back home. I missed the feeling of home, even though I had so much trauma in Ontario. And I really miss like some of my really good friends, like my best friend Kayla. Her and I have been going strong for almost 10 years now. And, she had kids that I really wanted my daughter to be able to grow up with a sense of family. So I decided one night that I just couldn't live in Montreal anymore. I was too depressed. I felt too isolated. So I messaged my landlord, paid her an extra month, and left. And ended up staying at a friend's house for a little bit. I think it was about 2 weeks. And then I found my condo that I live in now, downtown Toronto. And I ended up with that $20,000. And with my partner, I ended up opening a vape store, which was kind of funny because I end up getting basically just going out one night and I went and picked up a vape from the vape store that was down the street from my house. And they asked me if, I was looking for a job and I was so caught off guard. I was just like, yeah, I guess like I don't have a job right now, but I was kind of living in that sense of stable till I could find something I love to do. But I was like, you know what? It'll be good to bring in a little bit of money. And then I worked there for, I think it was like a month or two. And I started to realize how much money they were making and how easy it is to run a vape store.
Oh, okay.
Like, it kind of felt like one of those impossible to fail.
Hmm.
So While I was working at the vape store, I ended up getting an email from my old worker at Covenant House about a peer support worker program through George Brown and a organization called the Community Healing Project. And it was basically where you go for 12 weeks and you learn how to do workshops for youth and you teach them about mental health, gun prevention, gang prevention, and about grief and loss and all these kind of like untalked about subjects in school,
Hmm.
you know? So, and I ended up being fired from the vape store because the manager accused me of stealing, even though I did not steal. He also accused me of leaving the door unlocked, which I don't know if you know anything about like downtown Toronto, but if a store, they accused me of leaving it since I worked there. Every single day I left the door unlocked, apparently, after I closed up shop. If that was the case, especially in the area that they were in, somebody would have broken in. It was very, it was just one of those situations where the manager was trying to get his personal friend hired, and I guess I was kind
No.
of just the only thing in the way at that time. The manager ended up getting fired actually right after I got fired as well because they found out he was lying and giving people deals that they shouldn't be giving. So I ended up going through this program to get my peer support worker certificate. And, I was teaching out in community centers. And then during this time, I really started to buckle down on the idea of opening a vape store. So I went through the process. It was very daunting at first, especially because I had no promise that this would be successful. I was going to put all my money into it. And
There's no partner. It's just you.
so my partner, yes, he was helping out a lot, but he was basically letting me take the lead on this.
Mm.
He was more of, I'm gonna help as much as I can, but he again, it was just one of those things, like, you never imagine opening a vape store, like, that's not a dream a child has when they're growing up,
Okay.
and it was definitely one of those I did it on a whim of seeing for this short period of time I worked in that vape store of how much money they were pulling in, and viewing it like in the sense of a convenience store. As long as I'm far enough away from everybody else for convenience, people will have to come to me.
Yeah. Location is big.
Yeah, and there's so many laws that come around it. Like you're not allowed to advertise, you're not allowed to have anything like any product seen from the street, so you have to have all your windows covered up. So it really was one of those, like, I have to just base it off of convenience. So yeah, I ended up opening my vape store. I completed the peer support worker program. I worked with the community healing project for about a year, but I ended up leaving just because I felt like even though they were teaching great things, I still felt like it was almost not enough. I was seeing youth who were obviously, who were getting involved in the wrong crowd, I had overheard a couple girls talking about, making money online and things like this. So I was only allowed to talk about the stuff that we were taught. And because of, my history and everything, my ears and eyes were always open. And I just felt like there was so many more things that we could be doing for these youth and teaching them as well. So I ended up leaving just because I felt like I needed to do more for the communities and just have a talk about how to properly cope when you're grieving a loved one or, after a situation because again we were out in community centers, so there'd be times where there'd be a shooting that would happen and we'd come down and we'd talk about it,
Hmm.
but I feel like one conversation isn't enough.
I find from my perspective, and especially being on the police side, and then, law enforcement isn't traditionally very open with things that are happening, and it's not that they're not truthful, but they just kind of withhold a lot of stuff. They're more guarded. And I find a lot of organizations are like that now. Everybody's worried about liability. So we don't get any true conversations. I won't say true because people might misconstrue what I mean by true, but um, depth. You don't have the critical conversations anymore. People just kind of like do the bare minimum. If they do have a conversation, and even within those conversations, it's very superficial, as if that makes sense. Like it's not,
Yeah,
yeah, we're not getting to the actual root of any issue because everyone's so afraid of hurting feelings. And I'm going to end up at some human rights tribunal. It's like we can never have a real discussion that's going to fix anything because everybody's got all these safeguards in place and they're worried about liability. It's just, it's gotten way out of hand in one direction. And
100%.
yeah, we need to kind of bring it back.
I ended up actually leaving. I can't disclose what happened just because of,
Mhm.
contracts and everything. But the main reason I ended up leaving was I witnessed something horrendous happen. And I was told that basically it wasn't my job and I wasn't trained in it. So I need to step back and do my role, which was a turning point for me because I was like, my role is to protect these children at all costs. I don't care if, we're just supposed to be here teaching a workshop. But if something happens and I notice that it's putting somebody's life at risk or there's something happening, I'm not the type of person who's just going to stand by and stick to my role. I'm very outspoken and I'm going to do what I feel like I need to do to protect these children because, again, they are children.
Mhm.
So yeah, basically exactly that. Because of liabilities, I wasn't allowed to do what I felt like was right. And then I ended up leaving. So I, at this point, had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I had this vape store that was basically funding my life. So I'd be able to, kind of pick up a side project if I wanted. And I ended up kind of just talking to my customers at this time of like, man, I don't know what's happening anymore. Like, I feel like I need to do more, kind of just picking people's brains. And I had one customer come in who was a journalist, and we got on the topic about sex trafficking and how there's no open conversations, especially for the vulnerable sectors and especially for youth, about how to protect yourself. I mean, we hear things like the boyfriend this or how, like don't date somebody older or how people might try and groom you. But then there's never those conversations of how do you even realize that it's getting to that point? How do you even realize that you are being trafficked? What is being trafficked? How do you even explain that to a child who's like 12, 13 years old? How do you protect them online? And not only that, but just like my situation, how do you go from having a female who you trust and, you basically are willing to put your life in their hands, and then how do you know if they're safe or not? So we end up talking about how basically sex trafficking is not an open conversation and there's so many aspects to it that need to be talked about. And then she asked me if I'd be willing to do a story on it because she had tried before and it got dropped. So I said, yeah. And let me see if I can get more people who are willing to talk because just as a survivor, of course, I think my story is important. But I also feel like, law enforcement, frontline workers, first responders, community healers, all these people who actually see sex trafficking, their voices matter too, especially parents and things like that. So I started to reach out to everybody I had kind of met while I was doing my workshops, and I started reaching out to anybody and everybody I could think of. And within a week, I had like 100 people willing to go on record and talk about sex trafficking and how horrible it is and how there's not enough conversations about it.
Wow.
And she wanted to share my story, as well in that, and because my story is a little bit more gruesome and everything else, they basically said no, and they also told her it wasn't the right time of year for it. And January
Okay.
is the right time of year, January and February, because January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and then we have February, which is Human Trafficking Awareness Day. So if she wanted to bring this out, then she would have to wait a couple months and try and bring it around again. So I got very mad,
Yeah.
is the best way I could describe it, because I was like, how, for me, I was like, how did I even get so many people to be willing to talk about this? And the fact that there are so many people who are willing to go on record and talk about this, there's obviously something that's happening where everybody feels like this is, the light should all be on for everybody. Everybody needs to know about this.
So one thing, if I could jump in there too, is
Yeah.
these this whole like every day is a day for something and someone, and then there's a month for everything and everyone. I can get behind some of them. However, when it comes to the things like the human trafficking, and I guess this would even extend to some of the other stuff, like you say, like Black History Month. Shouldn't every day just have that incorporated into it? Shouldn't that just be part of history? Shouldn't it just be part of the conversation? Like, especially with the human trafficking, like, so we have to wait till January to tell people about it. What about the people being trafficked for the other 11 months of the year? Like, this stuff happens every day.
Exactly.
So, we're only going to bring awareness for the one day or the 1 month. Like, maybe it should be a part of the conversation throughout the year, and we amplify it a little bit during that month. But yeah, I I can't stand like a lot of that stuff when I think people don't realize that some of these conversations are very important, time sensitive too, when especially when it comes to the human trafficking, sex trafficking. Like, we're talking about kids here. There's no day off. One of the people I had on the podcast before, they're in charge of a joint forces operation out here that's province wide, and they talk about just the commitment of some of the investigators when it comes to these internet child exploitation crimes. And they actually have to tell the people, like, you're done work and you have to take a day off, because they would actually just work through and through. And they are like, if I'm not doing this right now, that's another few minutes, another hour, another day that person is experiencing this. So it's like soul crushing to know that stuff is going on out there. And yeah, so I sorry went on a bit of a rant, but it's very important that it is year round conversations. So
Especially because, human trafficking brings in like the most money. It's just, and everybody has their hand. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people who shouldn't have their hands in it. And the fact that we have to, of course, dedicate a month to it, but the fact that, even I was told with 100 other people behind me being like, you guys have a great story, but this month just isn't the month for it. And then we have the issue of January or February, we have all these stories come out and they almost get lost
mhm.
because there's just so many things that get talked about during that time. And then as soon as it ends, it's like an automatic shut off to society where we just don't talk about it unless, God forbid, something happens like the Epstein or Diddy case, or, they find there's a sting operation and they rescue a bunch of girls or guys from it. And it's just like, it shouldn't have to get to that point. It really should be an open conversation. And in the past 2 years, I've seen like, more conversations happening. Like they're passing laws in schools now where you have to talk about it.
Mhm.
But it shouldn't have taken that long. Like we're in 2025 now. So
Well, and I think that speaks to the point you made there a bit earlier about they were hesitant or didn't want to talk about your story because they say it's gruesome. Well, you know what? If it's not, I don't think it's necessarily our job to protect people's sensitivities all the time. And I think we can always find a format and a forum to tell these types of things in. I think the public does need to know. They need to know what it sounds like. They need to know sometimes what it looks like. Can't necessarily let them know what it feels like, but if we're just giving them these kind of like half-assed stories and versions and I don't want to say like woe is me type stories, but it's just like little bits here and there, and it's like it's kind of out of sight, out of mind is the feeling that I get where what kind of impact are we really having if we're not telling someone's truth? And like we had that conversation, right? When we had the phone call before we decided to do this recording. And it's like, yeah, I'm not looking to censor somebody's story. Obviously, there's a way you can present a story that doesn't need to always have like vulgarities or just super over graphic nature, but to tell the story as close to the truth as possible, I think is necessary. There's a requirement that we do that because like what you're trying to do is truthfully educate people on just what it's like, what the experience is like. And then now you're also trying to work on the prevention side. And I'll tell people this when I talk to gang members and when I'm talking to them about their lifestyle and how to get out of it or how to change things, when you soft sell it or you try to bullshit them, that doesn't resonate with them. So I imagine it would be the same for people that you're talking to, like especially with the younger generation. If you're not giving them the truth,
100%.
yeah, you're not giving them the goods. It's like, yeah, that's nice. Like they're not going to listen to you. You have to talk with uh, feeling and emotion, but also reality. And I think that's a much more effective way to get the message across.
And if we're sugarcoating everything, like one of my biggest things is, of course, I know it's so hard for survivors to go and tell their story. I mean, even me, I've had, a couple breaks since I've started my process and trying to, educate people and give back. But without people actually understanding what's happening, nothing will ever change at all. I mean, you hear sex trafficking, and unfortunately, I've interviewed over 600 people now, which I'll get into that.
Hmm.
But during that, so many people that I talked to had told me like the stuff that they had heard about sex trafficking at first is always the boyfriend. And it's always, the girlfriend who's just trying to please her boyfriend. And she just gets trapped in the cycle when there's so many other things that happen. And it's not even always just a boyfriend. It could be a friend. It could be family. It could be, anything. Or even at that, the people who have no knowledge of it at all, they view it as you're just picked up off the side of the street, put into a van, things like that. And even during, my interviews, I had people who had told me that they didn't even know sex trafficking happened in Canada like this,
Yeah.
which is how terrifying is that when you have all of these organizations, all these people, all these survivors who know what's going on, but then the majority of society is just like, oh, that could never happen in my neighborhood.
I think a couple reasons that it might not be talked about, unfortunately, is because um, people are either scared to talk about it and they're like, I really don't know how to talk about sex in general is a taboo kind of topic. It's not generally brought up at parties, but there's everybody's involved from top to bottom. It doesn't matter if you're living on the streets
Yep.
and then you're at the shelters and you're using drugs to judges, lawyers, doctors, athletes, police, as you brought up, like everybody's involved at different levels. And that's what I think really gets it shut down is people just kind of go like, no, we don't really want to talk about this. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the unfortunate part. Just before we do get into talking about your organization, I just wanted to ask a couple quick questions about the story we've kind of covered so far, if that's okay.
Yes.
I wanted to ask where a few of these people are now, if you know kind of what's happened to them or where they're at. If we could kind of start with Ashley, so your friend from back then who kind of got you into that first situation with Jamie. Do you know where she's at or what's happened with her since?
So I had one run in with her after I had left, escaped, and it was about a year afterwards. And she basically told me that I owed her money, and they would find me one day. So since then, I've had no communication with her. I have no idea what happened to her or Jamie.
Okay.
And with Sam, we stayed in contact for a little bit, but it sort of fizzled out as I grew on. And I just wanted to kind of separate myself from all those situations. Also, it kind of got to the point where I didn't need, to call somebody for help anymore. I was finally able to manage myself, and get my life back on track. And I'll touch on my boyfriend that I hitchhiked to BC with. He ended up passing away.
Oh,
He um he had a schizophrenic episode and got dragged by a subway in Toronto, and he was dragged
jeez.
for 2 stops, before anybody noticed, and, unfortunately, he did pass away. But a lot of the people from my life back then, even friends and stuff like that, either everybody died or ended up in jail, basically. And so I obviously don't have contact with those people anymore. And it really does just kind of, break my heart in some ways because I look back and there are some people, living in Toronto now. I'll be walking down the street and I'll see people I used to be friends with, on the side of the street, homeless, all drugged up. And it's just one of those, I guess you can call it like survivor's guilt, where I'm like, how did I make it out, but these people didn't? Especially when I was so young. And I used to look at some of these people like they had it together, they figured it out. Which also just goes to show how low of a point I was at thinking that some of these people had their lives together. And it really is sad, but
Well, it could be a lot of wasted potential. I mean,
yeah.
some of these other people maybe were on a good path and then they make a few wrong decisions and now they're in your situation or they're doing something similar. What about your mom? Is there any relationship there now?
So I tried. My mom has this, I'm trying to think of the nicest way I could put it. She wants everybody to think that her life is perfect. So when I started going down and trying to visit her to see my sister, there was a few times where she called the police on me because she said she didn't want me around, and then I started bringing gifts for her and my sister, and then she wouldn't call the cops anymore. So I'm not saying it was just because of the gifts. Maybe it was time, but from the way it felt to me, it was definitely felt like it was because I was bringing her gifts or money or gift cards. And then when I had moved back to Toronto, I really did try. I got a call from my sister basically asking me to come to a funeral. And this was the first time my sister ever really reached out to me and asked me to be there for her. So I tried. And for about 2 months over last summer, I was around a lot. And then there were just little comments that like my mom would make or my grandmother would make, basically how horrible of a child I was. And then one day when, my daughter was playing in the front yard with my sister, I had, kind of the perfect storm. My mom and I were just inside her house. I went to go use the bathroom. And I ended up sitting down and trying to have a conversation with her. And, over the years, I've sent her messages of, telling her that I want a relationship with her, that I needed my mom. And there were so many times where I was at my lowest point where, like, I remember one time I called her because I wanted to kill myself and she hung up the phone on me and she did not care whatsoever. So basically, I sat her down and I told her that my biggest fear in life is that she is going to be on her deathbed one day and that will finally be the time that she wants to talk to me.
Yeah.
And she did not take kindly to my conversation. I had asked her all the things about why did she abuse me? Why did she neglect me? But most of all, I asked her about Dan and why she allowed it to happen. She knew what was going on. Why did she play naive to it? And her answer, and she doesn't know this, but I'm sure she listens to this podcast. She'll know now. I recorded the entire conversation Just for myself, like, I'm not going to go after her for charges or all this other stuff. She has kids she has to worry about, but just for myself and kinda that, like, validation, I guess. So I asked her about Dan, and she told me that she didn't know what to believe and that her entire time knowing Dan, he was obsessed with her, and she used the term of he always found her hot and attractive, and she would never give him the time of day like that. And I turned around and I was like, "Well, I guess, he found me attractive enough too, and I didn't have the chance to say no." And she laughed.
Wow.
So that, really upset me. But in that moment, I kind of felt like I had released a lot of my, stuff that I always wanted to say to my mom. And then the next day, she sent me a very interesting message telling me that she doesn't agree with everything that I said, and that basically told me that my sister can never find out about the truth of what happened, and that I got a lot of things wrong, and that she had to bite her tongue, and that, you know, she had to stay mature during the conversation because she really wanted to pop off at me, which I listened back to the recording, and everything I said, she actually agreed with me on the recording. So it was just one of those moments where I guess that sent me into a little bit of a spiral. So since then, I have completely distanced myself. My grandmother and my mother have had my sister reach out to me asking me for money for things or about adult conversations that definitely should not be going through a child. So I sent my mom a final message last week, basically telling her and my grandmother that they need to allow my sister to be a child. And I'm setting this boundary for my sister. And I let them know that there is no reason why a child should ever be messaging me, asking me for money, saying that she's worried about my grandmother or her housing or this or that, especially because, again, she is so young.
How old is she?
She is 12.
Wow. Jeez.
Yeah. So it's one of those things of I tried to have a relationship and it didn't work. And then I tried to kind of just let her know my side of things, how I felt, questions I had, and she would rather play naive to it. And from what my sister knows, I ran away. So,
Mm. Yeah, they would tell that story, I guess, hey? You
yeah.
know, I guess you can only do so much. You can say what you want to say, you speak your piece and ask them for their reasons why, but ultimately they're not in a place for whatever reason to tell you the reasons um, why they did or didn't do things they should have, and says can't really do much after that, right? I mean, you've
Yeah.
extended the offer and it's not reciprocated, so unfortunately, it gets kind of left there until somebody at that other side of things tries to make something happen. So
Yeah. So it's hard, but, I spent almost a decade begging my mom to be my mom. And then right before my sister messaged me asking me to come to the funeral, I'd finally, after so many years of therapy and everything else, finally just accepted that I would never have that family. And then for me, it was kind of like the last effort.
mhm.
So, me being around for that 2 months, I really did try as much as I could, and, like, when I'd go and see my mom or my mom wouldn't even talk to me. She would talk to my daughter, she would talk, you know, to my sister about a situation, but then it would never be like, "Hi, how are you?" or "I love you," or "I'm proud of you." And as soon as she found out I had a store, that's kind of when it came into play where over the summer I was asked for so much money from them, which kind of just felt like almost like a slap in the face.
Yeah, it's definitely strange. Like you don't talk to me for however long, and then you're just like, "Hey, can I have some
Yeah.
money?" Yeah, no. So One thing I want to ask too on this was what's led you to a point now where you are comfortable talking about this stuff? Like, what, you know, I guess most people, you'd be the best to speak to this, but most people don't want to talk about these things that happen to them at all. And you're not far removed from it. So, and obviously, there's still parts of your life that are, carrying on from that. What has led you to be in a position where you're good with talking about it in the way that you do talk about it? So, what's the magic there that can make that happen? And is that something? Did you learn something that you could pass on to others that would allow them to do this?
Honestly, my care for other people, it is the best gift and the biggest curse. So after the story got dropped from the reporter and everything, when I started reaching out and trying to start my nonprofit, like I said, I did those 600 interviews. And basically, I interviewed anybody and everybody who would listen to me. And I mean, I've talked to orphanages out in South Africa, I've talked to people in Vietnam, Korea, Thailand, America, Canada. I literally just cold called and cold emailed people, just hoping that, people would talk to me. And in the beginning of that, I learned nobody wanted to talk to me because they were so hesitant. They're like, why do you care about this? This is weird. So I started to, in the beginning of my email, it wouldn't be, hi, I want to learn more about sex trafficking. It would be, hi, my name is Callie. I'm a survivor. This is my story. And I'd give them a little snippet of my story. And then at the end, I'd be like, I really want to make change. I really want to make a difference. And I would love to talk to you to see what you know about sex trafficking, what the gaps Canada has, what the gaps that we need to fill for survivors. And during that, I had the biggest mental breakdown of my life. I ended up in the hospital because my body was going into fight, flight, freeze mode to the point where it was literally fighting me. I couldn't eat anymore because every time I tried to eat, I would just puke up anything I ate. I would puke up water I drank. And it became this point where I actually ended up in the hospital and I dropped down to about 95 pounds. And I'm 5'7" for reference. So like the average BMI should be around like 120 at that point, I believe. So I was down to 97 pounds and I went to the doctors and they sent me to the hospital because I could barely hold my head up anymore. And through that, I really just started to try and understand, what was this issue. And of course, like I've always had therapists and all this stuff around me. Well, not always, but in the past couple of years. So I ended up talking to my therapist and my psychiatrist. And then I ended up actually dropping my psychiatrist because I felt like I needed medication. And she refused to give me medication because she felt like, I was able to survive without it. She didn't want me to become dependent on it.
Yeah.
And then, during the interviews, I started to pick back up after I got out of the hospital. It's actually funny. I just did my annual impact report for my not for profit. And I thought I took 2 months off, but I didn't. Turns out it was only a couple days off
Oh,
that I took after I got out of the hospital. And then over the summer, again, I had another little mental breakdown where I actually, and this is, it's hard for me to admit because I like to think that I'm stable now and all this other stuff. I actually admitted myself into the hospital because I was worried that, the best way I could put it was my brain was broken. Through sharing the stories, I started to have a trauma response where I was living, let's say I'd be walking down the street, or let's say I'd get up out of bed. And I'm not even joking when I say 24/7, 24/7, I had the scenes of my trauma playing in my head. And I couldn't escape it. And the way I describe it is it was like somebody was holding a YouTube video in front of me and it's just like on repeat of my trauma, of the rape, of the stuff that I've been through. And whether I closed my eyes, whether I was trying to do something else, no matter what I did throughout my day, it was just 24/7 on repeat. And I couldn't handle it anymore. But I felt like every time I tried to step back from my nonprofit, whether you believe in God or good luck or, everybody has a path in life, stuff just kept on falling into my lap for my nonprofit, like opportunities that I never thought I would have had. So I kind of felt like I couldn't give up,
Hmm.
which again, like I said, caring about the world is the best gift, but the biggest curse because it came at the extent of myself.
Let people know the name of the so Phoenix Arise
Yes.
Foundation, right? So this is
Yes.
the nonprofit.
So I ended up getting on medication finally and kind of learning what my boundaries are. Also, even though I went through therapy and talked about all my situations, there was a lot of stuff that I realized that I kind of suppressed. Even though I've talked about it through therapy, I kind of had this sort of mindset that these things are normal, right? Like these things just happen to people all the time. It's normal. And then I also, part of getting through the situations I was in, like whether I was being trafficked or assaulted, I always had this mindset that if it wasn't me, it'd be somebody else. So thank God it's me because God forbid somebody else was in the situation and they wouldn't have been able to make it out. And then, during sharing my stories and everything, realizing that I had such a low view of myself and self-worth when it came to these things because I always held that as, close to my heart. Like, thank God it was me and not somebody else. But then it kind of put into perspective of I still never deserved this.
Hmm.
And even if, that was the case, why is my life worth less than somebody else's in these situations? And, I guess really just having my entire like mental everything break down and kind of have to rebuild it put me in that position of understanding, okay, this stuff is hard. I'm still human. I can't go into this like I'm a robot and desensitize myself to it because no matter what, there's going to be days where, I go and tell my story. And let's say I've told it 20 times over, but the 21st time it's going to hit me. And you never really know when it's going to happen. So having those, securities in place where let's say I'm out on the job or I have a situation going on where I'm able to not only just advocate for myself, but also understand my own body signs. Where, let's say my brain starts, I used to have this situation since I've been on medication, thank God it's gone away. But it was like congested traffic where anytime I was doing stuff, not only did I have this video playing, but my brain was so loud that I couldn't even sit down without having, like, music blaring in my ears because it just felt like my brain was screaming at me. So really learning to not only just pace myself, but listen to my brain and also understanding that even though, yes, of course, my heart is in the good place, I also have to understand that I'm human, which is probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to accept that I'm not able to work like a robot
Yeah.
and that my story is not just a story. It's, my life, and, one of the hardest parts was seeing people's reactions when I would tell the stories because I'd be on Zoom for some of these interviews and just watching people be like, "What what are you saying to me right now? Like, how did you do this? How are you here right now?" It used to break me down because I would be able to share my story, but then seeing a human have a reaction to it would scare me more than anything because I'm just so used to, like I said, I did 600 interviews and the only way I got people to listen was to share my story. So just writing it out and it's so different. But it definitely was one of those things where it was a lot of learning and my entire brain had to break down and basically reset itself. And I have something called complex PTSD. So it's
Okay.
different than normal PTSD. And in that, I have severe complex PTSD because of all the things I've been through. So my brain works extremely different than everybody else's. And I really do just need to, take those times to myself and kind of just breathe. So again, I'm not perfect at being able to, step out and tell my story. Like there's even, after the first filming of the episode, I had to take a little bit of time to take a break and just breathe afterwards because it really is still draining to me.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Well, and I guess it depends on your audience, but yeah, it's not a story that you're going to just go and tell to anybody. But like I was saying earlier, it's the format and the forum of which you get the opportunity to kind of convey that. So, police officers and maybe war journalists can listen to what you're saying and kind of process it without having any overt reactions on screen or on the phone or wherever you end up doing these things. And, I think it would be hard if you're on one of those more mainstream ones like CBC or CTV or somebody for them to even really know what to ask. I mean, that's why partially why I do this because I'm trying to get real stories out there and have people in to talk about like real life. And it's not to sugarcoat it and it's to make sure that the public knows. And it's not necessarily, I think a lot of this stuff too is it's not just the individual who's telling their story. There's a lot of people along the way who come across you who will be impacted, good people that try to help a person in that situation and see the trauma or do experience it with them. I just think of all the calls that I've gone to where I've seen people chopped up. I've seen heads off bodies. I've seen major car collisions. I've seen, lots of gunshots, lots of stab wounds. Like you're dealing with that trauma, putting tourniquets on people, plugging holes, moving bodies. Like you also experience the trauma in a slightly different way, but in the same scenario. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. But there's a lot of people that will be impacted by one event uh, more than just the person telling their story. So uh, it's I think it's good that we get into these discussions and these forums where people can kind of share that. Um, Certainly for the mental health aspect, but it is to further tell people, hey, there's a lot of this going on out there. So yeah, this is what law enforcement deals with. The good people, not like the guy from your story, but that guy can go screw himself. But for police, you know, we see this stuff on a daily basis. I don't think we've necessarily done ourselves a lot of favors in how we've been very close, uh, holding things real close about what we're involved in. Like we need to tell the public the stories of what we see. So yeah, it's obviously I'm sorry all this stuff happened to you, but I think like as you say in retrospect, now that you're through the majority of it, you can look back and you wouldn't wish it upon anybody else. And you're like, I'll take it. I'll take that all day, every day. Um, you can certainly say that after the fact, having been through it, right? You wouldn't wish it upon somebody else at this point. So
yeah.
um, just as we kind of come up to the end of the time, I want to make sure we talk about the foundation. Just so Phoenix Arise Foundation. Can you tell us what exactly is the work that you're doing right now, and some of the stuff you've done with the kids? I think this is most of the stuff you've posted online. So, what exactly are you doing right now?
So I started work last year in November. And then I officially registered my nonprofit in April. Like I said, I did 600 interviews, and that wasn't only just to understand what we need to support survivors, but it was also to understand how a lot of these youth or vulnerable people get caught in these situations. Because again, everybody's story is so different. And even if there are things that seem similar, there is different tactics and different ways. And I feel like, in Canada and America, it might be different than in Thailand or Vietnam. So I really did start to dive in. And during those 600 interviews, I curated a set of workshops that I'm able to edit based off the group of people I'm working with. So I go into community centers, I go into, family situations, or sometimes I'll be asked to come out to like an event and speak. And during this, I'll spend, for instance, for the community centers, I'll spend about a week or two meeting consistently with all of the workers that are there to really understand the group that I'm working with. And for youth specifically, it's what are their vulnerabilities and what do these staff notice? So I'm able to edit my workshops based off of that. So let's say they're on Roblox all the time. I'll curate an entire section based off of, online safety, these game platforms. Um, and then I've been in community centers where the biggest fears are people who just hang around the community centers and come up and talk to the kids. So then I go into conversations about red flags, safe relationships. If you're 13 years old, there's no reason why a 20-year-old should be talking to you unless it's, like a police officer or a staff member. And even then, how do you know if they're a safe relationship? How do you know if they have your best interest at heart? Um, and then I go into conversations about, of course, the prevention side, but I also talk about how to not fall into this sense of glamorization of, you can hear rap songs about guys talking about having girls up in the telly and making money off of it.
Hmm.
So then I really go into the side of the mental health and teach these youth in hopes that, let's say, if anybody thought that was a cool way to make money, or, kind of like the life that they want to live, really show them how much it destroys somebody. And I'll go in and I'll tell my story. But of course, when it's for youth, I don't go into details. I tell them I was trafficked. I tell them, it was by my best friend. I go into, the mental anguish I was in, how I felt like there was no way out, how I felt like my life was less than. Um, and I really do try and connect with them because, again, we can always teach people how to protect themselves, but at what point are we teaching people to not do these things in general? Um, and then, so yeah, I do workshops, and that has been amazing. I've done 15 workshops since April, which is kind of crazy. I reached over 75 individuals during this, which has been absolutely insane. I'm also working very closely with Durham Regional Children Aid Services, which is also kind of crazy given my history with Children Aid Services.
But you can go in and make it better now, right? You have
Exactly.
firsthand experience. So, yeah, that makes sense.
And I've also, and I have permission to share this story, I also helped deliver a baby for a survivor, which was absolutely one of the most beautiful moments of my life. She had absolutely no supports. And when I found out about this, I had reached out to as many services as I could. And I was basically told, you can't expect us to be on call at nighttime. Um, so I went through a bunch of trainings for prenatal care. I went through trainings for how to deal with, somebody who might go through postpartum depression or trauma during labor. Um, so I really put myself in these situations where I not only am I willing to help people, but I'm going to go and do the trainings, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not just coming in here and I have no idea what's going on. I'm really going to go and make sure that I know the ins and outs as much as I possibly can so I can adequately support these people. And I'm in the process right now of trying to open a non residential rehabilitation center that focuses not only on traditional healing, so that means like nurses, therapists, psychiatrists, but also holistic. So that's like meditation, yoga. But then I also want to teach life skills. Like I said, I didn't know how to do simple things. And the average age of somebody being introduced to sex trafficking in Canada is 13, even though the average age of people who are in it are between like 18 and 25. But if you look at that, that means the majority of these people started around the time I was introduced into it. And then you're imagining how much can they really learn? Like, you expect them to be able, after they get out of this, sure, you go through therapy, let's say you get some funding or housing supports, but can they do laundry? Can they cook for themselves? Do they know how to go to a job interview? Do they even know how to hold down a job or how to have conversations with their boss to make sure that, no boundaries are being pushed or nothing's being inappropriate or they're not being overworked and underpaid? Um, and then one of my main goals is to hire survivors on my team. And during my interviews, I got offered a lot of jobs to basically just be a survivor. And that was the job I would be. Just go and tell my story, how I got out, and then that would be the repeat of it. And for me, I want to hire survivors on in a way that they'll thrive. So it won't be as a designated survivor role unless they ask. I will never go and ask a survivor to do that.
Yeah.
So I want to hire people on, let's say they want to get into marketing. So I'll put them through a course, get them trained in marketing, and then, be able to put them either whether they want to work for me on my team, or I partnered with quite a few businesses as well. So hopefully, be able to get them in there, or if they want to learn cooking, or if they want to learn art, and then have them host like art classes and, things that they really want and that will help them thrive in life. And there's just so many other things that come into play. Like, for instance, obviously through all this work as well, I'm still advocating for legislative change on some things, because unfortunately, the majority of cases that get brought up as human trafficking or sex trafficking, they get dropped down to either domestic or even a lesser charge, just because it's so hard. And I'm sure as a police officer, you understand, to gather the evidence, find the proof, and actually be able to prosecute in a timely manner. Because again, we have like this statute of limitation or whatever it's called on how long a trial can go for before it just gets stayed.
Yeah. Yeah. The Jordan decision.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there's so many other parts that really do come into it. And again, like, I only started in April and I've already done 15 workshops. I'm in the process right now, in the since it's 2025, I was going to say in the new year, but I'm going to be on a bunch of symposiums, and I'm going to be able to talk and share about not only just my story, but the struggle of finding resources and adequate help. I mean, a survivor gets out, they go to a shelter, all shelters are full now. They go and they go on the housing list, and they got to wait how many years before they get to the top of that housing list.
Yeah.
Um, and then, there's just not enough supports or funding or even trauma informed care. I mean, something as simple as like hotels. Are next in line for who makes the most money out of trafficking other than traffickers, because it's always happening outside of there. And the staff have a one little, training that they go through to teach about this, but they don't have the duty to report, and they're not trauma informed. So if there's a situation where a survivor escapes a hotel room and comes up to the staff have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
So things like this really need to change. And I know in the police force recently, they've implemented trauma informed care trainings and all this other stuff. Um, but even though that's great, there needs to be more than that. And especially in schools or even just therapists, there are so many therapists who are not up to date on the trauma informed care and how to adequately care for these people. Because again, I'm not saying they're broken, but they're very different than, the usual case that you're going to come across, especially because so many sex trafficking survivors, so many people had failed them along the way before they even got there. Um, So yeah, basically I'm trying to open the center to be able to help people and get them to be able to reintegrate back into society in a way where they feel like not only they fit in, but they can thrive and succeed. And as well as just try to make more noise about sex trafficking and get it more talked about. And really have people understand like how deep this goes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you know what? I think we can definitely, we have a million more conversations that we could get to here, because there's so much on this topic. I will definitely have to have you back on the show. Um, we're just kind of coming up to the end of our time. I want to make sure, give you the opportunity to say, where can people find you and your work? So, websites, social media, what's the best places to connect with you?
So my website is phoenixarisefoundation.com, and my Instagram is Phoenix underscore arise underscore foundation underscore.
Someone had the one less underscore name.
Yep. So I will also give you the links to that if you want to post that as well.
Yeah,
I'm very active on Instagram. I'm trying to get more active on the other websites as well, like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. But again, my team is very small. I only have a team about 4 other people right now. So I am doing most of the work myself. So Instagram is the best place to reach me, and my website as well. There's a little chat box if you ever want to send me an email through there.
awesome. Well, just as we're at the end here, I want to say, thank you for coming in and telling your story on here. Obviously, don't let the work consume you now. You got a good thing going and take breaks though. But thank you for sharing the story and showing, there is resiliency out there and that you are now willing to help others. So, can that obviously that can be a very difficult position to get to, but it sounds like you got things on track and you're doing great. So, thank you again for being on the show and hang on the line for 2 seconds. I'll chat with you just after.
Perfect. And I just want to add one more thing. Thank
Yeah,
you so much for having me. But also, if anybody ever listens to this and they feel like there's no way out, or they feel like they really are in the rut of it, I want you to know, no matter how dark it seems, there is always a way, and to never give up fighting. Because I wanted to give up 100 times over. And if I did, I would never be here. So, and there's always resources and ways to, get help as well. And just, yeah, never give up. Life is worth it.
I appreciate that. And yeah, I'll get the links up so people can get in contact with you. So yeah, thank you very much for being on here. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there. So pass it along. Thanks again.